You're too old to travel with us to Hawaii, Evelyn. Just watch the house. My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said. That's the moment I realized I wasn't just being left behind, I was being erased. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, stay with me. You're going to want to hear every word of what happened next. And before I go further, let me know in the comments, has your family ever made you feel unwanted? Subscribe and share this story if you believe respect is earned, not inherited. That morning started with golden sunlight streaming through my kitchen window, catching the dust motes as I set the table for breakfast. My son, Adam, and his wife, Jessica, had already begun discussing their upcoming vacation as if I weren't even in the room. Jessica's voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the air. We'll need to leave early for the airport if we want to make the most of the first day. Did you pack the kids' swimsuits? Adam nodded, scrolling on his phone, barely glancing up at me. The twins, my precious grandbabies, were bouncing in their seats, excited for the Hawaii adventure they'd been promised. The same one I thought I'd be part of. Last month, when the idea of a family trip was first mentioned, Adam told me with a smile, "You'll finally get to see Maui, Mom. We'll make it special." I had let my hopes flicker to life. I even started setting aside money for a new dress and reading about volcano hikes, eager to feel young and alive again. But over the weeks, Jessica's attitude shifted. She grew colder, always shutting down conversations if I tried to join in trip planning. She left travel brochures scattered around the living room, but whenever I picked one up, she'd snatch it away, as if the sight of me touching it annoyed her. I tried to ignore the chill in her eyes. I'd convinced myself she'd warm up. After all, hadn't I opened my home to her for years? Hadn't I helped raise the twins when Adam and Jessica both lost their jobs in 2020, after the market crashed? That was the winter our family nearly fell apart, and the winter I held it together, working double shifts at the library, cooking dinners, even covering their mortgage for 3 months straight. This morning, however, the truth hit harder than ever. I was never meant to be included. I was a stopgap, a caretaker, a background character in their perfect family photo. When Jessica said, "You'll watch the house for us, right?" she didn't look up from her suitcase. She just assumed. Assumed I'd stay behind, tending her garden, feeding her cat, watering her plants, keeping the home ready for their return. My son didn't defend me. Didn't even meet my gaze. As I washed the breakfast dishes, I caught their voices drifting in from the hallway. "She'll be fine here," Jessica said. "She loves routine. Besides, she'd just slow us down on the tours." Adam's voice was muffled. "She's not as spry as she used to be." The words stabbed at me. Not as spry. As if I were some piece of old furniture, no longer worth taking out in public. Later that afternoon, while I folded laundry in the quiet of my room, I overheard something that changed everything. Jessica was on the phone with her mother, her voice low but cruelly clear. "Adam's mom won't last much longer in that house. We just have to be patient. Once she's out, we'll have the place for ourselves. I'm already talking to a realtor. They said the market's hot, we could get close to $1 million. Just a little longer and it's all ours." My hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the basket. Was this how they saw me? An obstacle to be quietly moved aside, an old woman standing in the way of their windfall? I sat on the edge of my bed, the old quilt I'd made after Adam's birth bunched in my fists. The walls felt as if they were closing in, memories crowding around me, each one now tainted with betrayal. This house was the only place I'd ever called home. My husband, God rest him, had built the back deck with his own hands. Adam took his first steps on the faded hardwood floor. I'd weathered storms and heartbreak here, but nothing like this. Not this cold, calculated abandonment. As the evening sun set, I stared out the window and realized, if I didn't act now, I'd lose everything. My dignity, my home, my history. and something hardened in my chest. I would not go quietly. If Jessica and Adam wanted to see how much strength an old woman could muster, they were about to learn a lesson neither would ever forget. If you're still with me, don't go anywhere. What happened next shocked even me, and I promise, you won't want to miss the rest. Tell me below, what would you do in my shoes? Hit subscribe, and let's show the world that mothers are never as powerless as they seem. The house was silent that night, but my mind raced like a storm. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Jessica's words in my head, each one cutting deeper. Just a little longer and it's all ours. The greed, the entitlement, after everything I'd done for them. I sat in the armchair by the window, the one my husband used to claim after a long day, and stared out at the moonlit garden, remembering when laughter filled this home, when family meant something. Now, it felt like I was a guest on borrowed time. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Adam poked his head in, sheepish. "You're up late, Mom." I studied his face, my son, but somehow no longer my boy. "Just thinking," I said softly. He shifted awkwardly. "Jessica wants to know if you can look after the twins' goldfish while we're gone." As if that was my only purpose left, to care for things too small for them to bother with. When he left, I got up and opened the small wooden chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were decades of family photos, the deed to the house, and a faded letter from my late husband. My fingers trembled as I traced his handwriting. "You built this home, Evelyn. You keep it safe." I wiped away tears, anger, and pain swirling inside me. The next morning, the family bustled around, packing, laughing, preparing for their paradise. Jessica's parents arrived to help. They were all so polite, so practiced at ignoring me. "Evelyn, don't strain yourself," Jessica said, not even looking my way. "Just keep things tidy." Adam, in his old football jacket, gave me a distracted smile. "Back in 10 days, Mom. Try to enjoy the quiet." Not a word about joining them. No invitation, no seat at the table. As the car pulled away, I stood on the porch, clutching my cardigan closed against the wind, watching them disappear down the street. I felt hollow. Forgotten. But not defeated. Inside, the house echoed with the absence of voices. For the first time in years, I heard nothing but the creak of the stairs, the ticking clock, the hum of the fridge. I wandered from room to room, taking it all in: my kitchen, where I'd cooked every holiday meal; the living room, where Adam and I once danced when he was 6 and I was the only woman he adored; the garden, where Jessica had planted roses but never pulled weeds. I sat at the dining table with a pad of paper and a pen. If they could plan behind my back, so could I. I wrote a list: call realtor, sort personal items, find storage, look up apartments, talk to the bank. Each item steadied my nerves, made me feel less helpless. I remembered the way Jessica had talked to her mother, the casual cruelty of her tone. That wasn't my family, not anymore. I would reclaim what was mine. I started with the attic, climbing the ladder carefully, feeling the old aches in my knees. The space was filled with boxes: Adam's childhood toys, Jessica's forgotten craft supplies, old clothes they never bothered to donate. I worked for hours, sorting what mattered from what didn't. I found my husband's toolbox, still organized the way he left it. The scent of cedar and oil made my heart ache, but it also gave me courage. That afternoon, I called the realtor Jessica had mentioned. "Hi, this is Evelyn Harper. I'd like to discuss selling my house." Quickly. There was a pause on the other end, then a polite but surprised reply. "Of course, Mrs. Harper. I can meet you tomorrow." I scheduled the appointment, my heart pounding with both fear and hope. I spent the evening packing personal belongings, starting with the family photos. Each frame was a memory: a birthday, a first day of school, Adam's wedding. I took down the pictures of Jessica, careful not to break the glass. I didn't want reminders of her in my new life. I made arrangements for the twins' goldfish, calling my neighbor, Mrs. Lee, who was always eager to help. She listened to my story in silence, then hugged me so hard I almost cried. "You don't deserve this," she whispered. I nodded, unable to find words. The support of a true friend was worth more than all the empty promises of family. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something had changed. I was no longer afraid. I was angry, and determined. Jessica and Adam believed they'd won. They thought I'd just wait in the shadows while they took everything. But they underestimated the quiet strength of a mother scorned. Tomorrow would be the first day of my new life, and the last day I allowed anyone to treat me like a burden. Sunlight poured through the curtains the next morning, lighting up the empty house like a stage waiting for its main act. I woke before dawn, nerves thrumming with a strange energy I hadn't felt in years. Instead of the usual ache of being left out, there was a current of defiance in my chest, a pulse that told me it was finally my turn to decide how this story would end. After making coffee, I called my lawyer. He was an old friend, one who'd handled my husband's estate years earlier. I told him the truth, leaving nothing out: the overheard conversation, the realtor, the way Adam and Jessica were quietly circling my home like vultures. His voice was gentle but firm. "Evelyn, this house is yours. You get to choose who inherits it and when. If you want to sell, you're the only one who signs." With that reassurance ringing in my ears, I started clearing out the last traces of Jessica's life from my kitchen. Fancy appliances she'd used once then abandoned, trendy cookbooks that had gathered dust on the shelf, a collection of expensive teas she'd always complained were too strong. I packed everything neatly, boxing up her presents as carefully as I had once boxed up baby clothes after Adam was born. When the realtor, a sharp woman named Patricia, arrived that afternoon, I offered her coffee and showed her around the house. She moved through each room with a practiced eye, making notes, asking about updates and repairs, complimenting the light and the garden view. "You've kept this place beautiful, Mrs. Harper," she said sincerely. "If you want a quick sale, we'll price it right and target buyers who can move fast. Are you ready for that kind of change?" I nodded, feeling the ground shift beneath me. "Yes. I'm ready to move forward. As quickly as possible." Patricia smiled and handed me a folder with all the next steps, her efficiency contagious. We agreed on a listing price just below market value to attract cash buyers, and she promised to start showing the house immediately. After she left, I felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time since my husband died, I was steering my own ship. I spent the rest of the day calling moving companies, arranging for a storage unit across town, and sorting which things I'd take to my new apartment. I found a modest one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, a place with big windows and a small balcony for plants, just enough for me and the memories I chose to keep. By sunset, I was exhausted, but not from sadness. It was the exhaustion that comes from progress, from pushing through grief and fear to do something bold. I took one last walk through the garden, my fingers trailing over the roses Jessica never cared for. I whispered a thank you to my husband, knowing somewhere he'd be proud of me. That night, as I was locking up, Mrs. Lee stopped by with soup and a kind smile. "You always looked after everyone else, Evelyn. It's your turn now." Her words brought me close to tears. I realized that while Adam and Jessica had been planning their own future, I'd been too busy clinging to the past. But now the future was mine to shape, and I intended to make it count. Before bed, I wrote a letter to Adam. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't apologize. I simply told him I was making changes for myself and that I hoped someday he'd understand. I left it on his pillow, beneath the childhood quilt I'd sewn for him all those years ago. The house felt different as I lay down for the night. Not empty, but cleansed. There were no ghosts, only the echo of my own footsteps moving forward, away from the shadows, towards something entirely new. The next morning brought a clarity I hadn't felt since before Adam's wedding. I woke with the sunrise and, for once, didn't listen for the sound of children's feet or Jessica's sharp voice down the hall. Instead, I listened to my own heartbeat, steady and sure, a reminder that I was still very much alive, still capable of making decisions that mattered. By mid-morning, the moving company arrived. 3 men, all younger than Adam, worked with swift, practiced efficiency. I guided them through the house, pointing out boxes labeled for storage and the small pile meant for my new apartment. They didn't ask questions or look at me with pity. They just did their job, treating my things with care. I realized how refreshing it was to be surrounded by people who didn't see me as a burden or an afterthought. While they loaded the truck, I sorted through the last of the papers in my office. Years of financial records, birth certificates, my husband's discharge papers from the army, each piece was a thread in the tapestry of a life well lived. I kept what mattered and shredded the rest. I found a letter from Adam from his college days, full of youthful hope and gratitude. I allowed myself a moment of nostalgia, then packed it away with the things I'd bring to my new place. By noon, the house was nearly empty. I walked through each room, running my fingers along the walls. I paused in Adam's old bedroom, now barren except for the letter and quilt left on his pillow. I hoped the message would find him at the right time, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that once, I had loved him more than anything in this world. When the last box was carried out, I closed the front door behind me and slid the key into my pocket. It struck me how heavy it felt, even though the burden of the house, and of being unwanted, had finally lifted. Mrs. Lee waved from her porch as the moving truck pulled away. I smiled and promised to visit, meaning it with all my heart. Driving to my new apartment, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The building was older, with creaky stairs and faded paint, but my unit was filled with sunlight and overlooked a line of blooming cherry trees. I set about unpacking what little I had brought, family photos, a few books, the tea set from my wedding day, and the box of letters I'd carried through every move in my life. It was small, but it was mine. I didn't need anyone's permission to feel at home here. That afternoon, Patricia called with news. She'd already found a serious buyer for the house. He was offering cash, no contingencies, and could close in under 2 weeks. Relief washed over me. The plan that had once seemed so terrifying was moving forward faster than I ever imagined. I walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench beneath the trees, breathing in the scent of spring. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream, not about what I'd lost, but about what might still be waiting. Maybe I would volunteer at the library again, or take a painting class like I'd always wanted. Maybe I would travel somewhere for myself, not because someone else wanted me to go. As dusk settled, I realized how much lighter I felt. My life was no longer dictated by other people's plans. Jessica and Adam would return to a world they couldn't control. For the first time since my husband died, I was truly free. That night, as I drifted off to sleep in my new bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never again let someone else write the ending to my story. The first full day in my new apartment dawned bright and still. There was no Jessica barking orders, no clatter of children's shoes on the hardwood, no feeling of being watched or weighed down by silent expectations. Just my own breathing, the whisper of the wind through the cherry blossoms outside my window, and the steady tick of the clock. The air tasted fresher than it had in years. I made coffee and sipped it on the balcony, watching the sun climb above the rooftops. I realized with a jolt that it had been so long since I'd chosen what to do with a day. The prospect felt unfamiliar, almost luxurious. No one needed me to cook or clean. There was no list of chores to check off for anyone else's sake. For the first time in years, I asked myself, what do I want to do today? After breakfast, I called the bank to finalize the transfer of the house proceeds into my account. The manager recognized my voice and asked if I was finally taking the trip to Paris I'd always talked about. I laughed, honestly laughed, at the memory. Maybe I would, just not yet. For now, I told her, I was focused on building a life that felt like my own. I spent the morning arranging my new space exactly as I liked it. I hung my favorite photos above the kitchen table, Adam as a toddler in the sandbox, my husband standing proudly in front of the house he built, and a younger version of myself on a windswept beach, grinning with wild hair and sunburned cheeks. I realized how far I'd come from that girl, but also how much of her remained inside me. I placed the wedding teapot in a spot of honor, along with my husband's old toolbox, a small reminder of resilience and self-reliance. Late in the day, Mrs. Lee visited. She brought a basket of fresh bread and a handwritten note wishing me happiness and peace. We talked for over an hour, sharing stories and quiet laughter, our voices echoing in the uncluttered apartment. When she left, she squeezed my hand and told me she admired my courage. It was a word I hadn't heard in a long time, and I let it settle around my shoulders like a warm shawl. In the afternoon, Patricia called again. The buyer's offer had come through, higher than she'd expected, even after accounting for the rush. You could walk away from this with a clean slate and enough to do whatever you wish, Evelyn, she told me. There was a note of genuine excitement in her voice, as if she were rooting for me the way a true friend would. I thanked her, feeling a wave of gratitude for every woman who had stood by me through these hard months. As evening fell, I cooked dinner just for myself, my favorite soup, with extra garlic and a side of crusty bread. I ate slowly, savoring the flavors, the silence, the simple satisfaction of nourishing myself for once. After dinner, I called Adam's number. I let it ring twice, then hung up. I wasn't ready for whatever conversation might follow. Instead, I wrote him another letter, longer this time. I told him I loved him, but that love doesn't mean allowing yourself to be used or erased. I left the letter unsigned, a message from a mother who finally understood her own worth. When darkness settled, I went out onto the balcony and looked up at the stars. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't wishing for a different life or a kinder family. I was wishing only for courage to keep moving forward and a heart big enough to embrace whatever came next. I fell asleep that night feeling both empty and full, empty of the bitterness that had weighed me down for so long, and full of hope that the years ahead, whatever their shape, would belong to me and me alone. I woke up to a flurry of text messages from Adam and missed calls from an unknown number. For a moment, the old fear crept in. Was something wrong? Had the twins gotten sick? Had Jessica lost her luggage? Did they need money? But as I scrolled through the messages, the tone was unmistakable: panic. Adam's texts bounced from casual to frantic. Mom, we're back early. Where are you? Why is there a for sale sign in front of the house? Why isn't anyone answering the door? The unknown number was Jessica, I realized. Her messages, unlike Adam's, were short and icy. What's going on, Evelyn? And this isn't funny. For the first time in years, I let the phone ring and didn't answer. I didn't owe them anything, not an explanation, not an apology, not even the courtesy of a quick reply. I was under no obligation to play the villain in a story they'd written for me. Instead, I slipped on my jacket and went for a walk beneath the blooming cherry trees, breathing in the fresh air and feeling the distance growing between the life I had and the one I was determined to build. Patricia called as I sat on a park bench watching children play, their laughter echoing across the grass. The closing on the house was set for the next morning, she said. All that remained were signatures and a transfer of keys. Are you sure you're ready? She asked. Absolutely, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Back at my apartment, I found another message from Jessica, this time angry, almost desperate. You can't just sell the house. That's Adam's family home. Where are our things? What are we supposed to tell the kids? I stared at her words, marveling at how easily she erased my existence from the equation. Adam's family home, as if I were some caretaker or hired help instead of the woman who'd paid every bill and kept that roof over their heads for years. I decided to call Mrs. Lee. Her voice was a balm. "They came by looking for you," she said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. "They seemed very surprised when I handed them the key to the storage unit and said you'd moved out on your own terms." I thanked her for handling it with more kindness than they deserved. That night, Adam called again. This time, I picked up. His voice was small, uncertain. "Mom, what happened? Why would you do this?" I wanted to say, "Why did you let her treat me that way? Why did you stand by and watch as I became a stranger in my own home?" But I only said, "Adam, I did what I had to do to take care of myself. I hope one day you understand." He was silent, then muttered something about the kids being confused, Jessica being upset, and needing time to process. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for smoothing things over. I let him sit with his discomfort. "I left you a letter," I reminded him quietly. "Read it when you're ready." Then I wished him good night and hung up, my heart trembling but certain. The next morning, I dressed in my best skirt and blouse and went to the closing with Patricia. The process was businesslike and efficient, a series of signatures and handshakes that felt like the final act of a play I'd never wanted to star in. When the buyer handed me the check, I felt nothing but relief, no regret, no longing, no shame. I walked out into the sunlight, my purse heavy with the price of my freedom, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground firm beneath my feet. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and toasted to a future where I answered to no one but myself. My phone buzzed again with more messages, but I turned it off and watched the stars appear over the city, knowing I'd finally chosen myself, and that was enough. The days after the closing passed in a kind of quiet haze, as if I were still floating above my own life, not quite touching down. But soon, reality took on a new texture, one that felt crisp, unscripted, and honest. I spent my mornings exploring the city, wandering through markets and museums, savoring the anonymity and the small joys that came with living on my own terms. I bought myself flowers for the first time in decades and arranged them in a chipped blue vase on my kitchen table. Meanwhile, Adam's calls grew less frequent. The first few days, his voice was pleading, bewildered, sometimes angry. "Mom, Jessica is furious. The kids don't understand. How could you leave like this?" But each time, I told him the same thing. I left because I had to, Adam. I needed to start over. I hope you find the strength to do the same someday. Eventually, his words began to soften. There was less outrage and more confusion, a searching quality that reminded me of the boy he'd been, before entitlement and Jessica's cold ambition hardened his heart. Jessica, on the other hand, never called. I heard about her only through Mrs. Lee, who delighted in updating me with snippets from the old neighborhood. "She's been to the storage unit 3 times this week, you know," Mrs. Lee reported. "Told everyone you just vanished, but I set the record straight. People here have more respect for you than she ever did." One afternoon, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, a card arrived in the mail from the twins, crayon drawings of a house, a stick figure grandma waving from the window. I pressed it to my chest, letting the warmth of their innocent love settle my spirit. I wrote them a letter in return, promising to visit soon and reminding them that home is not always a place, but the people who truly care. With the proceeds from the house, I allowed myself a few indulgences. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, nervous at first but quickly finding joy in the mess of color and creativity. My classmates were a mix of women and men, most of them also at some kind of crossroads, and together we painted away the ache of old wounds. I realized I was not alone in needing to begin again. Weekends, I volunteered at the library, shelving books and reading stories to wide-eyed children whose laughter filled the space with hope. I found myself seeking out new friendships, lingering over coffee with neighbors, accepting invitations to join garden clubs and potlucks, simple things I'd forgotten could bring so much happiness. There were hard moments too, of course. Loneliness crept in on quiet nights. I missed the twins' sleepy hugs and even Adam's awkward attempts at affection. Sometimes, regret pressed down on my chest, making me question everything. But each time, I reminded myself that love, to be real, cannot cost you your dignity or your peace. As the days grew longer, I began planning a trip, my own trip. Not to Hawaii, not to Paris, but somewhere I'd never been, somewhere chosen just for me. I bought a sturdy new suitcase and tucked the twins' drawing inside for luck. I realized, as spring faded into summer, that the greatest gift I'd given myself was the chance to begin again on my own terms. I no longer needed anyone's approval to feel worthy. The world was suddenly wide and open, and I walked into it with my head high, a mother, a survivor, a woman who had finally learned to put herself first. Summer arrived in a blaze of sunlight and warm evenings, painting my new world with a vibrancy I hadn't felt since I was a girl. Each day began without expectation and ended without regret. I settled into a gentle routine that belonged entirely to me, and in those quiet, ordinary moments, I felt the bruises of betrayal begin to heal. I filled my days with the simple pleasures I'd set aside for years. I wandered through the farmer's market every Saturday, filling my basket with fresh peaches and sunflowers, chatting with vendors who soon learned my name. I took long walks by the river, letting the sound of water and the laughter of strangers fill the space that once ached with loneliness. I joined a book club, where I discovered the quiet thrill of new friendships blooming over shared stories and coffee. My painting classes became an anchor, each session an escape into color and memory. I found myself painting scenes from the past and visions of the future, my childhood home, the cherry blossoms outside my apartment, the swirling blue of an imagined ocean I might someday visit. My instructor, a kind-eyed woman named Lila, encouraged me to try self-portraits. At first I balked, afraid to see my own pain on the canvas, but then something shifted. I painted myself standing tall, gray hair shining, eyes steady and clear. I realized that for the first time in years, I liked the woman I saw. Meanwhile, Adam's calls had dwindled to almost nothing. The last time he rang, it was a short, awkward conversation. "The twins miss you, Mom. They talk about you all the time." I told him I missed them, too, and that I hoped they were doing well in their new school. He didn't mention Jessica, or the house, or anything from the life I'd left behind. For the first time, our silence was not filled with blame, it was just silence. I kept in touch with Mrs. Lee, whose updates were less frequent now that she and I were both moving on in our own ways. She called one afternoon to tell me she'd seen the twins with Adam at the park, laughing and chasing each other through the grass. "You did right by yourself, Evelyn," she said quietly. "And I think one day, Adam will understand." I began to imagine what might come next. I considered taking a train trip up the coast, maybe even flying somewhere new, alone, on purpose, just to prove that I could. I started a journal, filling it with hopes, sketches, and lists of things I wanted to try: pottery, cooking classes, maybe even ballroom dancing. But perhaps the biggest change was internal. I no longer woke up with the old ache in my chest, the feeling that I was waiting for someone to see me, to thank me, to give me a place at the table. I'd built my own table now. I invited friends, neighbors, and, most importantly, myself. One night, as I watched the stars from my balcony, a gentle peace settled over me. The hurt had not vanished, but it no longer ruled my life. I had become my own home, a place of comfort, hope, and quiet joy. I knew there would always be scars, but I also knew they were proof that I had survived, and that I had chosen my own ending. And somewhere out there, I sensed that Adam was starting to change too. Maybe he was seeing the cracks in his old life, maybe he was learning something about loyalty, love, and the true cost of indifference. But whether or not he ever understood, I knew I had finally learned to forgive myself for staying too long and to celebrate the courage it took to walk away. One Sunday morning, while the cicadas hummed outside and a soft breeze fluttered through my curtains, I received a letter postmarked from Adam. The sight of his handwriting jolted my heart in a way I hadn't expected. I sat at my kitchen table, the one covered with flecks of paint and old memories, and unfolded the pages with trembling hands. His words were hesitant, uncertain, but there was an honesty there I hadn't heard in years. He wrote of his confusion and regret, of how the past weeks had felt hollow without my presence in their lives. He admitted, quietly and without drama, that he hadn't realized how much I had carried, how many times I'd made sacrifices he'd never even seen. He apologized for letting Jessica's ambitions become his own, for failing to stand up for me when I needed it most. The twins keep asking when you're coming home, he wrote, and I don't know how to answer them. I wish I could undo what's been done. I wish I had listened sooner. The letter left me weeping, tears of sadness, yes, but also of relief. I had needed this, more than I cared to admit. Not for vindication, but for acknowledgement. For years, I'd lived under the weight of being unseen, of being made to feel small. Now, Adam's words shone a small light into the dark corners where that pain had taken root. I wrote back, taking my time, pouring out both my love and my boundaries. I told Adam I forgave him, but that forgiveness didn't mean things could return to the way they were. I explained how important it was for me to have a life that belonged to me, that being a mother didn't mean surrendering my self-respect. I told him I missed the twins and would always love them fiercely, but that I couldn't be their safety net if it meant losing my own peace. I let him know I was open to seeing him and the children, but only if he could accept me as I was now, a woman who had finally learned to value herself. In the weeks that followed, Adam wrote again, sometimes sharing stories from the twins, sometimes simply updating me on his life. I sensed a change in his tone, less entitlement, more humility. He sent photos of the twins' art projects and a picture of them playing in the park, grins wide and eyes bright. Each letter was a step toward healing, a bridge being rebuilt one careful word at a time. Meanwhile, I continued to stretch my wings. I took a weekend trip to a small town by the sea, wandering cobblestone streets and tasting pastries in sunlit cafes. I sent postcards to Mrs. Lee and to the twins, telling them about the lighthouse I climbed and the seals I watched from the pier. I bought a scarf the color of the ocean and wore it home as a badge of my newfound freedom. One Friday, Lila from painting class invited me to a community dance. I almost said no, old doubts surfacing for a moment, but then I remembered the promise I'd made to myself to say yes more often. That night, surrounded by laughter and music, I realized how far I'd come from the woman who once waited by the window, desperate to be needed. Now, I danced for myself, not for anyone else. The world outside my apartment kept turning, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. I had learned to forgive, not just Adam and Jessica, but also myself. I let go of the years spent wishing for their approval, and I embraced the messy, beautiful truth that happiness had to begin with me. As the summer drew to a close, I found myself looking forward to each new day, not because someone might finally notice my worth, but because I already knew it. I had claimed my story. I had survived, and I had flourished. The first cool winds of autumn drifted through my window as I sat on the balcony, a mug of tea warming my hands, the city bathed in amber and gold. Looking out at the world, I felt no longing for the past, no bitterness for the wounds I'd carried. I felt only gratitude, for the pain that woke me up, for the courage that kept me moving, and for the new life I'd carved from the ashes of the old. On a quiet Saturday, Adam brought the twins for a visit. There was an awkwardness in his shoulders at first, but the children's excitement broke the tension in an instant. They ran to me, arms wide, shouting, "Grandma," as if nothing had ever changed. We spent the afternoon baking cookies, painting pictures, and laughing until our stomachs hurt. Adam watched us, quieter than before, but I could see a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. When he thanked me before they left, he did so without expectation, simply and sincerely. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. For the first time, I believed him. That evening, alone again in my apartment, I let the memories roll over me, good and bad, the sweet and the stinging. I no longer needed to erase the pain to enjoy the present. I had learned to hold both, to honor what I'd survived, and to treasure what I still had. I picked up my paintbrush and turned to a fresh canvas. With bold colors, I painted a woman on a windswept shore, her hair streaming behind her, her face lifted toward the sky. She stood alone, but she was not lonely. She was rooted and reaching all at once. In every brushstroke, I poured the story of a woman who refused to be small, who had lost almost everything and yet found herself, whole and unafraid, on the other side. The phone rang just as I finished signing my name in the corner. It was Mrs. Lee, inviting me to a book club meeting, her voice full of warmth and belonging. I smiled, realizing I had built a family for myself, woven from kindness and chosen moments. I was not alone. I was not forgotten. I was finally home. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. If you've ever felt invisible, discarded, or unappreciated, know that you are stronger than you think, and your story isn't over yet. Please share your own journey in the comments. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in second chances and self-worth, and pass this story along to anyone who needs a reminder that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. Your next chapter starts now.